Okay, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to CalRecycle's fourth workshop on Senate Bill 212, which is the Pharmaceutical and Sharps Waste Stewardship Program. I'm Howard Levinson, Deputy Director at CalRecycle, and I'll just be making some introductory remarks before we turn it over to staff to present on today's topic, which is the draft regulatory text for this program. This is an extremely ambitious and important endeavor because unwanted and improperly managed pharmaceutical drugs and sharps waste present a number of very significant public health and safety and environmental problems at the end of their life. So to address this, Senate Bill 212 was enacted in September of 2018, and it established safe and convenient disposal options for home-generated pharmaceutical drugs and for sharps waste. The Senate Bill 212 also established what we call an extended producer responsibility approach for this program, and it charged CalRecycle with implementing the program in coordination with the Board of Pharmacy, and I'm pleased to report that that coordination has been ongoing since the law was enacted, and it continues all the time. So with today's workshop, we are presenting draft regulatory text and soliciting your feedback on it. We conducted an identical workshop on May 17th in Sacramento to get feedback from Northern California stakeholders, and we got a lot of good feedback, so we're hoping to get the same kind of feedback today. Let me talk very briefly about the timeline for these regulations. It's pretty compressed. I've mentioned this at all the workshops, but it's important for everyone to understand the timeline that we're working under, because statute requires CalRecycle to adopt regulations for the administration of this program, and so that the regulations are effective beginning January 1st of 2021. And that's a year and a half away. Sounds like a long time, but it's really not. To accomplish that, excuse me, in accord with the provisions of the Administrative Procedures Act, we have to really start the formal rulemaking no later than fall of this calendar year, fall of 2019. That's because a rulemaking of this nature is going to be, it is complex, it's going to have some controversial aspects. We will need several rounds of formal rulemaking comment periods, probably, maybe two or three, two for sure. And it's very difficult to accomplish that in less than the full year accorded by the Administrative Procedures Act. So if we're going to have this in place by January 1 of 2021, we have to start the formal rulemaking period 3 or 4 months from now. What we've done to date is typical of how CalRecycle operates. We've had, this, as I said, this is our fourth informal workshop where we initially presented kind of just talked about the statute and got input from folks for 2 workshops, and then these last 2 workshops, we actually have draft regulatory text that we hope you will be providing some comments on. And to the extent that we can resolve some of the issues that you raised before we start the formal rulemaking period, it's just always better to have that in place and done beforehand. We also have a number of other activities that are going on congruently with this, with the draft regulatory text. We have to conduct an economic analysis of the impact of the regulations, and then we also have to conduct, look at the environmental review for the regulations, and those are all things that happen simultaneously and all have to come together in order for us to start the formal rulemaking activities later this year. So today's agenda, it's a very simple agenda. Staff is going to be presenting, going through the various sections of the SB212 draft regulations. What you see again is informal draft text. This is not formal rulemaking yet, so it's not set in stone. We want to get your input, and we will be making some changes accordingly before we take this to our director for approval to start the formal rulemaking period. So we're essentially in listening mode today to receive your comments, your concerns, your suggestions. We'd like feedback on technicalities. We want feedback on what you think is not workable and what is workable, whether we've missed anything, so that we can adjust this. There'll be ample opportunity for Q&A and feedback. We'll pause periodically during the presentations to take feedback, and what we'll ask is for you to come up to the microphones to the right and left of Paul, if you can raise your hand, and you can make comments there, and you can come up and back and forth as many times as you need to. This is being webcast, so we want to make sure that everybody who is listening in can hear your questions. And for the folks on the webcast, we will be taking your comments via email. If you can submit them to the following email address, pharmasharps@calrecycle.ca.gov. That's on your screen right now. Thanks, Paul. And then we will periodically look at those and convey them to everybody who's here, and so that that's in our notes as well. Two other things. One is we'll be taking written comments on this draft informal regulatory text. We'd like to get any written comments by July 1st so that we can turn that around and make changes and be able to have a revised text to start the formal rulemaking process in a couple of months. If we get your comments in writing earlier, that's better, but we certainly will, and we will take comments at any time, but in order for us to be able to accommodate and consider some of the things that you might suggest, we would like to get those within the next couple of weeks. Before I wrap up and give you just a couple of housekeeping details, I want to introduce the team. It's a full team now. We hired staff at the beginning of this year, and finally have a full team. And you can see everybody. We have way to my left, Julian Nguyen. We have Marilee Calindris, Marianne Chigbro, Mary Curry, Michael Turgeon. Jason Smith is the supervisor for this team. Cynthia Dunn is his manager and manages all of our extended producer responsibility programs. And finally, to my right is Mark DeBee, who's my colleague, Deputy Director for Waste Compliance Mitigation Division. And then lastly, we have Serena Reynolds in our legal office down in the front there, along with our Chief Counsel, Elliot Block. So that's our full team. Clark Williams is also the branch chief who oversees all of the EPR programs along with Cynthia. So that's our team. If you will be seeing some of them, if you've interacted with some of them. I know we are doing some site visits in the next couple of days, so many of you are hosting that, and I appreciate your willingness to engage with us on all these fronts. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Phones, please turn your phones to silent or vibrate, and if you do get a phone call, if you could step outside and take that, we'd appreciate that. Restrooms are located down the hallway across from the auditorium entrance. And then finally, in the event of an emergency, we may need to do a couple of different things. If there's an evacuation that's called, please exit the building through the exit doors at the back of the auditorium. If there's a shelter-in-place call, such as in the event of an earthquake, we'd ask you to please drop and cover your head and hold on to your chair. So hopefully none of those will happen, and we'll have a nice, safe workshop. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Smith to make the first part of the presentation. And if I forgot anything, I forgot to say that copies of the draft regulatory text are out to the door and on the table that you signed in at.
Great, thanks, Howard. Yeah, the draft regulatory text will be very handy if you don't already have a copy. They're just outside. We'll be going through a lot of it, and we won't always have the exact text on the slide, so it'll be a nice reference for you. So the next few slides I'm going to go over illustrate the same high-level timeline covered in the first few workshops and mentioned by Howard. So I'm not going to spend too much time on them other to remind us that the department's work over the next couple years will really be focused on promulgating regulations that need to be in effect by January 1, 2021. And this presentation document will be made available online, and these timeline slides are included so you can refer back to them. This slide has a few of the milestones that will follow the adoption of the regulations. And here's the outline of the regulation structure. Today's workshop is going to follow a similar format as the May workshop. We'll walk through the informal draft regulatory text being proposed. And these draft regulations address two fundamental programs. One is a collection location-based program for covered drugs with other activities. And two is a mail-back program for home-generated sharps that may include other activities. The panelists will take turn covering various sections. Some sections are more abbreviated than others, but we'll still be reviewing them all briefly in order to cover the sections in their entirety and pausing in case any stakeholders have comments or thoughts to share. I'd like to emphasize that we are in listening and receiving mode, and I can't stress enough that this is draft informal text. We're aware of some things that need to be fixed, but we're excited to hear from stakeholders on what other improvements can be made. The draft text represents what CalRecycle sees as necessary at this time to implement the statute based on our program and experience of overseeing other similar EPR programs. I'd like to highlight a handful of these sections that cover submittals of various deliverables. And as we develop the text, we notice a lot of similarities and overlaps. Future versions of the proposed text will likely have some sections combined. Okay, with that, I'd like to start with section 1, the purpose of these regulations. Fundamentally, the purpose of these regulations is to implement SB212. And after that, we're going to go over definitions. I'd like to turn it over to Michael Turgeon, who will discuss the next section.
All right, thank you, Jason. Okay, section 2 is the definitions. The following terms we think are necessary in order to effectively implement the law. And the first term we got up here is administrative and operational costs. In statute, this term refers to costs for a program operator to implement a stewardship program. Defining this term was prompted by stakeholder comment, and the definition we composed is derived from the mattress regulations, but with relevant terminology to SB212. All right, next up, homebound and homeless. These definitions are meant to clarify what persons qualify to request prepaid pharmaceutical mail-back materials. And in the context of a stewardship plan, one area we are continuing to look into in regards to these terms is what mechanisms of verification, if any, may be appropriate for a homebound or homeless individual that requests mail-back materials. Okay, home-generated sharps waste. The statutory definition of this term references the Health and Safety Code. However, the definition included here is intended to address the gray area that still exists in what qualifies as a home and what specifically qualifies as home-generated sharps waste. We're aware of the Medical Waste Management Act, which may already cover some sharps waste generated through in-home medical care. Our chosen definition may overlap in some of these care options, and we seek further clarification on this issue going forward, including we are in talks with California Department of Public Health in how they administer the Medical Waste Management Act. Okay, local jurisdiction and local agency. Statute refers to local jurisdictions and agencies in regards to reimbursement for home-generated sharps waste collected at household hazardous waste facilities. This definition we've included was derived from other programs and is meant to provide clarity regarding specifically what types of household hazardous waste facilities will qualify for reimbursement. Okay, minutes, books, and records, and prescription. Minutes, books, and records, which is a term that refers to record-keeping requirements, will be further discussed later on in the section that deal with audits. And prescription is just meant to clarify the difference between prescription and non-prescription drugs, even though the covered drug definition in statute applies to both categories. Okay, significant change. Statute requires program operators to submit any significant changes to stewardship plans in writing for approval by the department. This definition is derived from stakeholder comments and is meant to provide clarity on what specific types of changes to stewardship plans should be considered significant. Okay, and the final definition is stewardship program. Regarding our proposed definition of stewardship program in subdivision J, I'd like to refer to the statutory definition, which is that stewardship program means a stewardship program for the collection, transportation, and disposal of covered products. And I'd just like to point you to the context that that statutory term is used later on, in which statute says, this chapter does not apply to a drug or sharp within a jurisdiction that is subject to a local stewardship program pursuant to an ordinance that took effect before April 18th, 2018. If that ordinance is repealed in the jurisdiction, or if more than one ordinance is applicable, those ordinances are repealed in the jurisdiction. The drug or sharp shall be subject to this chapter in that jurisdiction within 270 days after the date on which the ordinance is or ordinances are repealed. Okay, that is the final definition, so we will move on to section 3, which is the criteria for determining a covered entity. Statute, specifically Public Resources Code, section 42030F2, requires the development of this section by saying the department shall adopt regulations on the process for determining what entity is a covered entity following the priority order set forth in paragraph 1 of Public Resources Code, section 42030F1A. And the proposed language in our draft regulatory text builds directly off of statute. It first identifies the manufacturers of covered products as the first entities to be responsible. And secondly, if this entity cannot be identified, the regulations propose using the statutory priority order found in Public Resources Code, section 42030F1B through E. Okay, and then section 4, submittal of product lists. The proposed text does not clarify requirements to the statutory process and is just referencing a statutory requirement to submit product lists to the Board of Pharmacy. This is included simply for convenience and clarity. Okay, with that being said, that's it for me, and in just a moment we'll open it up for any comments you may have. And again, as a reminder, just simply step up to the podium for comments or questions. Thank you.
Any emails? Any emails? No emails. Any comments from folks in the audience? I know some of you have heard this before. There are some important definitions in here that establish who's responsible. These are based on a lot of the experience we've had implementing other programs. We want to make sure that you pay close attention to those definitions and make sure that you understand them, and if you have any questions or comments, to let us know. We might have one coming up. As you come up to the microphone, if you can identify yourself by name and your affiliation so that we can take notes, and then folks on the webcast can hear who's talking as well. Thank you.
Am I on? There we go. Good morning, I'm Mike Winkle with MedProject, and have a comment around section 2 in the definitions regarding the home-generated sharps waste. We believe the regular definition or regulatory definition should be consistent with the statutory definition. SB212 clearly states that the home-generated sharps waste has the same meaning as the definition in the California Medical Waste Management Act. Expanding on this definition to include sharps generated by other sources such as residential care facilities is inconsistent with SB212, and the regulation should just directly reference the statutory definition or not include a definition. Thank you.
Thank you.
So regarding the home-generated sharps waste definition, we're aware there's something of a gradient in terms of in-home medical care in which patients or people using these facilities have a kind of a variety of levels of independence and stuff like that, and so we're kind of interested in tackling specifically what is meant by home and home-generated. And like I mentioned, we are working with public health and who administers the Medical Waste Management Act to make sure we can actually tailor this definition accurately to reflect the reality of things. So yeah, we're still working on it, and we're aware of the issue, and thanks for your comment.
Yeah, I'll need to. Um, So, sections 5 on page 3 and section 7 on the bottom of page 9, the stewardship plan submittal process. Statute lays out, actually, let me advance that. There we go. Statute lays out the process for submitting a stewardship plan, and this section of the draft text outlines the information required. The language in this section is also duplicated in the Sharps plan. We differentiated them as a distinct section in the regulations to account for the possibility of a program operator submitting a plan for covered drugs only, a plan for Sharps waste only, or a plan for both. As mentioned, we are considering combining the submittal sections in the future versions, since they are so similar. So to summarize this process, we are requiring contact information, electronic submittal, accessibility standards, and a hard copy of the plan. The review process is summarized as outlined in statute and is basically 30 days to review the plan for completeness, 30 days for resubmittal if it is determined incomplete, and 90 days for the department to approve a complete plan. So moving on to the next slide. Section 6 on page 4 outlines the required components of a stewardship plan for covered drugs. Most of the language in this section repeats statutory requirements for completeness, so I won't spend much time going over them. These subdivisions include compliance with all applicable state and federal laws, various necessary contact information, product list, and notification requirement of any changes. I'd like to note an error on our part on page 5, line 8. The text reads A, B, C, and D, but it should be B, C, and E, if you'd like to make note of that. So moving on to G, the plan has various requirements. Let's see, did I advance that? No, there we go. The plan has various requirements for a program operator to address related authorized collectors outlined here. Turning to page 6, H requires a program operator to submit determinations of compliance, and I assures sufficient program funding. Next slide. On page 6, subdivision J outlines the stewardship program's handling, transportation, and disposal systems. There are 12 components that the program operator shall describe that are listed on the slide. But I'd like to point out a couple. Number 6, the tracking mechanism for collection, transportation, and disposal. We would like to highlight this paragraph, in particular to seek feedback for detailed requirements. We are considering including examples of product tracking processes, metrics and processes for product weight collection, or transportation and disposal record-keeping requirements. These requirements relate to Section 15 record-keeping requirements presented later. On page 8, number 12 requires program staffing description. Currently, this requirement resides in the handling, transportation, and disposal system subdivision, but we may find it better placed elsewhere within the reg text in the next version. So continuing on page 8, K requires a description of how and where records will be maintained. Again, this may be related to the record-keeping requirement in Section 15. L, description of how the plan would provide for expansion into local jurisdictions in the event of a local ordinance repeal. M, education and outreach. This section outlines the program's promotional efforts to maximize participation and has a variety of requirements. N explains the notification process of confidential policies and procedures. And finally, O allows the department to request clarifying information to assist in plan approval consideration. Moving on to page 11, we're going to transition into Section 8, Stewardship Plan for Home-Generated Sharps Waste. Before I begin, I would like to note that we are aware there are 2 subdivision Cs. We will be fixing that in the next version. So most of the statutory requirements are the same for the 2 plans, and a lot of the content in the covered drugs plan text is similar to the Sharps plan. I will be highlighting the differences unique to the Sharps plan. The covered drugs program is primarily a receptacle-based program, while the Sharps plan requires a mandatory mail-back program. Therefore, the Sharps plan does not require authorized collector and authorized collection site information, nor does it specify minimum convenience standards. However, statute does not exclude receptacle-based programs, so the draft text contains provision for other collection methods in addition to the mandatory mail-back program. And next slide. A through F are similar provisions to what is covered in the drugs plan. Part G has fewer components than the drugs plan because it doesn't contain collector and collection site convenience standard requirements, as shown on the slide. Additionally, tracking mechanisms and record-keeping processes are combined in the Sharps plan. And lastly, education and outreach. There are subtle differences between the 2 plans, but we intend to conform the text in the next version. Additionally, language regarding information on collection site locations is omitted from the website and the phone number component. So this concludes the plan sections, and we'd like to ask if there are any comments. Let's see, I'm going to go.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm Carrie Hoffman with the Product Stewardship Work Group. Thanks for allowing me to speak today. You went through that very quickly, so I did have, and again, recognize that the language is duplicated in various sections, so both, my comments can apply to all sections that use this language. So specifically, my first comment is around covered drugs in 6D, in terms of the verified list. We feel that it is unnecessary because CalRecycle can obtain the State Board of Pharmacy verified list at any time, and also that it is impossible to comply with because SB212 does not authorize verified covered product lists from the State Board of Pharmacy to be released to the public. So we think that this language referencing verified lists should be eliminated. And my next point was in F of, also in other sections of 8 regarding the Sharps program of 6F around the frequency. If the requirement of the covered products is not eliminated, we think that the quarterly updates is quite burdensome for the covered entities to comply with, as there are new drugs constantly coming onto the market. And think that that would be something that would cause concern. And there's already a provision in SB 212 that provides an annual process for the update to the State Board of Pharmacy, so that a quarterly would not be necessary. We think that this additional language exceeds the authority of SB 212, so we ask that the quarterly requirement be eliminated.
Thank you for your comments. We'll take that into consideration.
Good morning again. Mike Van Winkle with Med Project. Have a number of comments on section 5 and 7 and also section 6. So starting with really section 5 and 7, so we recognize also that the regulatory sections for establishing the submittal procedures for the stewardship plans and the annual reports for covered drugs and Sharps, they could be combined for ease of reference. So I think that's the direction you're signaling, since the submission process is the same for the both. However, and I will spend a little more time on this later, we do not support combining the substantive plan and annual reporting requirements for covered drugs and sharps, since SB212 establishes a completely different framework of really the programs for those product types. Another question or another comment on section 5 and 7 really is that all program operators should be treated equally with regard to the plan submission review process. Specifically, program operators should be held to the same plan submission deadline and or all plans should be reviewed on the same basis so that it all kept in the same cycle. We also think that it's important for CalRecycle to clearly define the expectations and timing for the plan submission process. So SB212 requires program operators to submit a complete stewardship plan for approval to CalRecycle about 6 months after adoption of the regulations. However, there is some ambiguity regarding this deadline since the program operators also have to submit to the other applicable California agencies, such as the State Board of Pharmacy, for review before submitting to CalRecycle. So it would be helpful if CalRecycle could clarify the time it takes for these other applicable agencies to review the plan, and will postpone the deadline for submitting the plan to CalRecycle if there's some sort of timing irregularity. And also, CalRecycle should clarify that we'll hold all program operators, again, to that same timeline during this review process. Another question or another comment, on section 5 and 7 would be, in addition to the regulations to define a timeline or time frame for submitting a revised stewardship plan in response to feedback from CalRecycle. So if CalRecycle decides to conditionally approve or disapproves a plan after reviewing it, the regulations should give program operators at least 60 to 90 days to revise and to resubmit its plan. So the other program regulations for mattresses and architectural paints both allow, I think, a 60-day to submit a revised plan, which reflects the fact that the program operator needs sufficient time to address some of the comments that could be coming back to revise and really be responsive to CalRecycle's feedback. So in our experience, revising a plan can be involved, and it can take some time to actually consider all the changes in the context of the program. This can require a program operator to revamp or expand its program or renegotiate with vendors. So therefore, we believe the regulation will give at least a minimum of 60 to 90 days to resubmit a plan should it be conditionally approved or disapproved. And then I think it came up in one of the earlier sessions, but a hard copy of the stewardship plan should not be required. An electronic version is also submitted to CalRecycle. I mean, nothing in SB212 requires a specific format for plan submissions, and we just encourage CalRecycle to continue to provide flexibility to either submit an electronic version or a hard copy of the plan. On section 6, so I mentioned earlier, again, the desire or the recommendation that the substantial requirements for stewardship plans and reports for covered drugs and sharps waste should be set forth in separate sections of the regulations to avoid confusion and really recognize the differences between those two programs. And again, we do, it's an entirely different approach for managing the submission because it's important. Those plans are just going to be different, as clearly laid out in SB212. I think the other thing, too, to think about is that the regulations cannot compel the program operators to take on the obligations of other regulated entities, like pharmacies, to comply with SB212. There are a number of different instances in the draft regulations where it appears the program operators would be held responsible for the actions of the other regulated entities. For example, there are some examples where ensure that retail pharmacies comply with their obligations to serve as authorized collectors, or in addition to training the authorized collectors and certifiers to ensure their compliance with all applicable laws or federal and state law. And while the program operators has the obligation to contact those potential authorized collectors and provide an opportunity for them to participate in the stewardship program, they can't force anyone to participate. In addition, a program operator can take some reasonable measures through contractual obligations to require collection sites and vendors to comply with the law as a condition of being part of the program, but they cannot be responsible for ensuring that they do not, they do so, or for any training, which is really the obligation of the collection sites or the vendors. So our recommendation, the draft regulation should be amended so that the program operators are not held responsible for ensuring that others that are outside of their control comply with the law. Moving on, the program operator should not be required to provide updates regarding non-significant changes to a stewardship plan on a quarterly basis. SB212 does require that any significant changes to the plan be submitted in writing for CalRecycle's approval. However, there really is nothing in 212 that requires frequent plan change or updates for other changes that are not considered significant. Instead, 212 does rely on the AN report really as the vehicle for the program operators to communicate updates to the plan. So as currently drafted, the regulations do appear to require quarterly updates for a lot of other aspects. Entities participating in the program, authorized collectors, and just it would be burdensome for the program operator to review and update all of this information, and it should really be removed from the regulations since there really doesn't seem to be a justification for those quarterly updates and no really basis in the statute. The regulation should also affirm that any proprietary and confidential or trade secret information submitted in the program can be designated as confidential and protected from disclosure. SB 212 allows for a broad protection of any information defined as proprietary. This includes trade secret and confidential commercial or financial information. However, the regulations only mention proprietary information in a few limited circumstances, and the regulations should state that proprietary information submitted in the stewardship plan and reports, program budgets, and any other information submitted under SB 212 can be protected really from disclosure and consistent with the statute. Thank you for a chance to comment. I know I gave you a lot of comments there.
Well, that's a great set of comments, and I see that you're reading them. Obviously, you didn't have those memorized. So hopefully you will submit those in writing and so that we're taking notes, but clearly it's going to be hard to catch everything. So to the extent you can submit those in writing, that would really help us make sure we're checking through each one of those. And I don't know if there are any specific responses anyone likes to make. Jason?
Yeah, certainly. A couple of questions as follow-up. You had mentioned a lot of the statutory requirements as part of the submittal timeline for a plan. I'm curious, are you suggesting that we clarify certain aspects of those statutory requirements and timings, or that we include them for convenience and clarity in regulations?
Yes. So you're asking, in the SB 212, the program operator submits it within 6 months, but there is language about the program operator submitting it to the other agencies before it gets to CalRecycle. So it would be helpful to understand that sequence, the timing of such between the agency's feedback and then ultimately the feedback to the program operator, given at least 60 days to incorporate could be significant feedback before giving it to CalRecycle. So that is what we'd be looking for clarity around.
Okay. And then you mentioned the relationship between a program operator and an authorized collector, and I think there's some language out there already that talks about good faith negotiations in the relationship. Do you have any suggestions or expansions on what a good working relationship or the responsibilities of both parties in that relationship should be?
Yes, I think perhaps to Howard's comment that we could use our written comments to provide some of those suggestions back to you.
Great.
I just go back to the fact that we as a good program operator can establish contractual relationships with other regulated entities, and through those commercial agreements have those types of expectations set up for compliance with state and federal law, but that's different than what the current draft regulation appears to say with regards to ensure, so we can provide some additional comments on that.
Okay, thank you.
While Cynthia and Jason are trying to figure out whether they want to ask you another question, I just want to clarify one thing about written comments submitted in the informal period, just so that expectations aren't raised. These are extremely helpful to get your perspectives and to make sure that we are looking at all those issues that you or anyone else who submits written comments raises. I do want to make it known that we don't necessarily respond to those individually, as opposed to in the formal rulemaking period, when every comment that we get, we ultimately have to respond to individually as part of the rulemaking period. So we really appreciate written submittals now. It really helps us in this informal period and allows us to have a dialogue back and forth. But you don't expect, other than a cursory thank you for submitting that, don't necessarily expect a formal response. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Understood and appreciated, and appreciate the opportunity to have the dialogue and provide the comments.
Also, I want to piggyback on what Howard said. We do have all the informal comments submitted so far up online in a little chart for you to review. Thanks.
Okay, sections 9 and 11, annual report submittals. There's a lot of similarities between the submittal process for covered drugs and for sharps, and because of this, we are considering combining these two sections. The submittal process is similar to the requirements we've already discussed today, and so I will not be going into great detail, but I would like to point out that the review process is a 30-day process for completeness and a 90-day review period for consideration of approval. This is different from the submittal process for plans, which spells out a revision and submittal process. On to the annual reports for covered drugs. We are noticing a lot of similarities between section 10 and 12 for covered drugs and for sharps waste annual reporting. Because of this, again, the department is considering combining these two sections. The annual report for covered drugs, number 1, contact information. So program operator contact information should be provided here. 2, the executive summary, it's an introduction for the report, highlights the most relevant topics that will be covered in the annual report. 3, the collection system. There are 7 components to the collection system. This is a large part of the annual report. It's for including data and details, such as how things are going, setting up the convenience standard, geographic spread, any challenges that the program operator might be seeing with setting up collection sites. A addresses authorized collectors and collection sites. Here the department wants to know progress on negotiations for establishing collection sites, good faith effort, how pharmacies were contacted, and establishing communication with them and sites. B, collection method available for covered drugs as described in the stewardship program, in the stewardship plan, sorry. C, requires an update on meeting the convenience standard and geographic spread of setting up collection sites. Example of maybe one thing that should be included in this would be maybe there's challenges setting up collection sites in rural areas. D, requires an update on best management practices employed, so how were state, federal regulations complied with. E, F, and G, collection data. This is outlined on page 16, beginning at line 22. The data for the collection system, we want to know about the authorized collection sites, mailback program, and other supplemental methods if those are outlined in the stewardship plan. For example, one-day take-back events. Some of the metrics we require to measure progress are location of kiosks, if kiosks are part of the plan, number of pickups, weight of covered drugs collected, quantity of containers provided, etc. We're aware that the reporting weight for drugs will also include liners, bins, things like this. There may be other parameters that should be included to provide a more robust picture for evaluating compliance with the convenience standards, so we welcome your feedback on this. Now we can transition from the collection system to transportation and disposal. Transportation and disposal should include the protocol for pickup of covered drugs for disposal, methods for tracking, changes to policies and procedures, things of that nature. 5, address any safety and security issues that occurred over the reporting period and their implications. 6, education and outreach components are on page 18. Require an update on efforts to maximize education and public participation. This might be flyers, social media campaigns, media ads, things of that nature. And part of this is to also include D, evaluation of performance. This will provide us with a method to measure effectiveness of education and outreach and to identify points of potential improvement. Seven, requires an update to any policies and procedures determined to be confidential by the program operator. 8, verification. This is straightforward. We just want re-verification annually of participating covered entities, covered drugs, authorized collectors and their contact information, and authorized collection sites. 9, significant changes. There's 2 parts to this. Covered entities shall describe any significant changes to the approved stewardship plan, including rationale and outcome. And second, expansion into new jurisdictions. The department recognizes that there's a transition phase between repeal of a local ordinance and the program operator implementing a new stewardship program. And so we would welcome feedback on any other provisions or timelines that should be clarified. Section 10, identify any agency determinations of noncompliance. 11, audits conducted of the program operator or stewardship organization. So this would be minutes, books, records, and also the audit, financial audit of the stewardship program. The annual report regulations for both covered drugs and sharps waste do not include the updates shown here from the stewardship plan. We are considering incorporating them, even though they're not included right now. We still expect them to be included in the annual report because section 42033.2 of the Public Resources Code states that the expectation of the annual report is to include all items in the stewardship plan. Okay, so now we can switch to the annual report for sharps waste. There are many similarities in the text between covered products and sharps waste. However, the regulations for the convenience standard has been omitted for sharps waste. Instead, the sharps waste regulations focus on the mandatory mail-back program. I would like to highlight the slight difference in the collection system portion of annual reports between these two. For sharps, there are 5 components, which again focus on the mail-back system, and therefore omit numbers A and E, which are found under covered drugs. as these refer back to collection sites and convenience standard. The verification system is the same for both. Authorized collector, the current regulations, I should say, as they're written at the moment, both address authorized collector and authorized collection sites. These are terms that under statute apply only to covered drugs. Depending on the stewardship plan, these terms may or may not be applicable under Sharps waste. Therefore, the department intends on revising the regulatory text as appropriate. All right, next slide. The proposed regulations do not elaborate on statutory requirements in 42033.5. However, we recognize the concern of covered entities wanting to document assuring only accurate and legitimate claims are submitted, while on the other hand, local governments are concerned with the scope of documents that are required and the timeliness of correspondence. We welcome feedback on this as CalRecycle considers a balanced approach. This concludes annual report section. We'll take comments now.
Good morning. This part of the presentation will discuss program budgets. Regarding program budgets, I would like to acknowledge that there are two different budgets mentioned in statute. The initial stewardship program budget for the first 5 years that is submitted along with the stewardship plan, and the program budget for implementation that will be submitted on a yearly basis. The first annual program budget will cover two time periods. The first annual, that would be January 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2021, and January 1st, 2022 to December 31, 2022. Subsequent reports will cover the upcoming calendar year. One clarification that I would like to make, on page 25, line 29, if you're following along in the draft regulatory text, the word may will be changed to become shall, for shall be submitted. This was an oversight on our draft regulatory text, and we will be correcting in future revisions. And in regards to the complete program budget, this slide describes the factors that the department will review in the budget submitted. Per draft regulatory text, the two components that should be included in program budgets are anticipated cost with narrative description of the cost categories, along with the recommended funding level necessary for implementation, and an independent CPA financial audit of the stewardship program. The submittal process and approval process is similar for this annual budget as it is for all other submitted documents. For today's presentation regarding budgets, we would like feedback on what changes, if any, could clearly identify the required components of a program budget. Our next slide looks at the record-keeping requirements that we are looking, that is currently in the draft text. This provision outlines all of the parties that are required to maintain records. It also clarifies the requirement of entities to provide the department access to facilities, operations, and any relevant records. Consistent with statute, the department may take disciplinary action against an entity that fails to provide access. The regulations provide the clarification of the disciplinary actions the department may take if an entity fails to provide the department access and/or records. Continuing with record-keeping requirements, this component of the regulations has been developed to support the department's need to verify covered products sold, as well as identify covered products and manufacturers that are not compliant, and verify stewardship program implementation by the program operator. And this is in reference to the slide discussing retail pharmacies and retail pharmacy chains must provide access to existing records on all covered products sold or offered for sale in the state, including items 1 through 4 mentioned in the slide, such as the manufacturer of the covered products, to the certification letters from the department, if any, are provided to a manufacturer. This slide right here discusses the administrative fee to the department and stewardship organization audits of covered entities. These are included for clarity and convenience and refer to statutory requirements that address the administrative fee as well as the stewardship organization's audits of covered entities. At this time, we're looking for comments regarding these sections. Next up would be Mr. DeBee, Mark DeBee, and he'll be talking about enforcement.
Thanks, Mary Lee. At least we have one comment coming up. Please.
Again, thank you for the chance to comment. Mike Van Winkle with Med Project. We have a comment on Section 14, program budgets. Consistent with earlier comments, Med Project would believe that the program's total anticipated cost could be broken down into just 3 categories. Collection, disposal, processing costs is 1. The administrative cost is 2, and outreach education as 3. Med Project currently distributes into these cost categories, and while the draft regulations do contemplate additional or different categories, particularly in the area of collection, transportation, processing, disposal, it's really our experience that these services are often intertwined from a purchasing perspective and can be a little, typically not necessarily broken out. So we believe that providing the 3 cost categories demonstrates, and while demonstrating adequate funding, would meet the CalRecycle's, or at least the intent and satisfy SB212. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Mark DeBee with CalRecycle in the enforcement group. We are part of the team, myself as well as Trevor O'Shaughnessy. It's reflective, I think, to pull back the screen a little bit, the curtain a little bit, to realize that we have the team up here, the majority of folks that are going to do the yeoman's work in developing the regs with our input on enforcement, but they'll also be the group that will help implement these regs relative to plan submittal reviews and approvals. Enforcement comes in when things don't work right as they should. And within CalRecycle, that is a completely independent, separate group that makes that assessment. And so I just wanted to point that out, that we're following that model with the implementation of this program, that there'll be one group that will be working with the various entities involved to establish the plan, but then there will be a separate group that will be responsible to ensure that all those requirements are met through the enforcement process. So let me begin the presentation relative to PRC 42035C, which requires those that sell or offer for sale covered products to monitor the department's website to verify covered entities and stewardship organizations and the covered products they provide are in compliance. So to show compliance with the website monitoring requirement, we're proposing language in the regs that basically allows entities involved to show a proof of website monitoring through a certificate process. So in general, this is how we envision the system to work. The department will develop a website for entities, retailers, pharmacies, wholesalers, distributors to access. Logging on will require the entity to provide identification information, for example, the entity's name, contact person, address. This information will be used to fill out and populate the certificate. The entity will then be provided the department's list of manufacturers and covered products receiving through the plan annual reports and any updates from the program operator. The entity will review the list to verify the manufacturer and or the covered products being sold, dispensed are indeed listed. The entity will check a box that they've successfully identified and verified the manufacturers and or covered products on the list. If a particular manufacturer or covered product cannot be verified, the entity will be provided the option to report the manufacturer or covered product to the department, and that's consistent with 42035C. Upon completion of the verification, options to either print a certificate or have it sent electronically will be provided. The certificate is to be maintained and updated when an entity sells, offers to sale, or dispenses a new covered product or covered manufacturer. A valid certificate is to be provided to the department upon request. So a little bit additional information that I think that speaks to some of the comments that we've received. Verification that a specific manufacturer is compliant would meet this standard. This allows for reduced verification efforts by those who handle large quantities of covered products produced by the same manufacturer. A single proof of website monitoring certificate will represent all the manufacturers and covered products sold, offered, or sale dispensed by the entity named on the certificate. This slide speaks to the imposition of administrative penalties. The statute outlines that penalties can be up to $10,000 per day. Statute increases penalties to a maximum of $50,000 per day when the violation is proven to be intentional, knowing, or reckless. And the reference to that is 42035.2A2. This information, by the way, is on page 30 of the regs. This section of the regulation outlines the factors that will be considered by the department when determining the amount of penalty. The factors presented are consistent with those used by the department in other EPR programs that we oversee. The statute also provides the department the authority to administratively issue penalties. In summary, this means the department can have informal administrative hearings and does not need to file accusations with the Office of Administrative Law. This section of the regulation outlines the process the department will undertake to provide due process to any entity found to be non-compliant with the law. The process is consistent with the Administrative Procedures Act. The specific statute is incorporated into the regulation language, and that's on page 30 and continued on to page 31. I believe we'll take comments on this as well as other aspects.
Thanks, Mark. Any comments, questions about enforcement procedures, imposition of administrative penalties? Okay, I don't see any, and we don't have any email comments. Remarkable that we didn't get questions on penalties yet.
Okay, I'm just going to go over some of the next steps and do general wrap up. So thanks, Mark. We're asking for written comments by Monday, July 1st. This will really help us as we're preparing to enter formal rulemaking. And it says October 2019 on the slide, but that may change depending on revisions to the regs and the input we receive. I'd like to emphasize that what you see in some cases is just a starting point for folks to react, consider, and provide input and comments. And this really helps us get to that fall formal rulemaking time. And I want to emphasize that it's very easy to have dialogues and interact with you during this informal comment period. So please, if you identify anything, bring it to our attention sooner than later. We really appreciate that. I'd like to publicly thank the team working on these regulations. My unit started coming together early this year, and we've made a lot of progress I'm very proud of to date. With that said, we still have a lot of progress to be made. So thank you for working with us in such a short time frame. And we'd like to thank all the folks that have met with us to date. We will continue to schedule individual stakeholder meetings. And please contact us if you haven't heard from us yet and you want to schedule a sit down. We're open to that as well. With that said, I'd like to turn it back to Howard for wrap up and general Q&A.
Thanks, everyone. So I want to just give a chance if anyone has any other comments or questions that they want to offer today verbally. We're happy to hear them, but certainly we want to engage, as Jason said, in continued informal dialogue with you. In terms of the starting the formal rulemaking, I would urge you, and I think all of you are, but make sure that you're signed up on the listserv so that you can get the latest announcements and information. What will happen when we're going to take the comments that we got today and from the last workshop and various meetings, and we will be revising the text at sometime in the fall, date to be determined, but October, give or take. We will bring an item, we call it a request for approval, to our public monthly meeting. That will be for the director to approve the regulatory text, and at that point, once he's approved that, we will submit the formal rulemaking package to the Office of Administrative Law, and as soon as OAL signs off on that, then we will begin the actual formal rulemaking period. So most likely what you will see next will be in a couple of months. It'll be a new text that's revised based on some of the feedback that we've gotten, and that will be what we're taking to our director for starting that formal period. And once we get into that, I think many of you are familiar with that process. We can explain that later or offline, but that's a very formal process where we have to do certain things and respond in certain ways depending on where we are in that formal rulemaking process. So I'm not seeing any other comments or questions. I want to thank you all for being here today and for the feedback that you've provided last month and today. That's really valuable, and we look forward to further discussions with you. So thanks a lot, and we'll call it quits for now.